In this video, I haven't done a Dune video in quite some time. So if you want more Dune content just like this, let me know down below in the comment section. And also, slap a like on this video. Like goal will be 420. And then also, subscribe. So that way, I'll know, hey, we want more Dune content. But this is like a beginner to intermediary Dune guide. I'll be talking about several different things that I think need explaining for prep for, Dune Part 2, the conclusion of the movie adaptation that came out in 2020, and then also just some other further aspects that I'd like to see if we get some more Dune, material brought to life on screen. Please slap a like on this video. Like goal is going to be 420, and then also make sure you subscribe. Turn those notifications all the way on. Thank you for watching. Okay, so let's start with the best character, the main character of these movies, and then the first couple of Dune books. And then he's also referenced heavily in pretty much his actions affect the rest of the story, right? So in short, let me start by saying this. Paul Atreides is a prophet. He's a prophet for his son, Leto II. So at the end of Paul's journey, right? And I guess this is spoilers for Dune Part 2, and then eventually the third Dune movie, which will cover the events of Dune Messiah. And I don't know if we'll actually get to see Paul's death on screen, because that doesn't happen until Children of Dune, right? So ultimately, after Paul is the first Atreides to mount the Lion's Head throne, right? So that's the throne that the Padishah Emperor is sitting on. And in the Dune movies, he's going to be played by, get this, of all people, I was about to do an impression. It's Christopher Walken, right? But he's like, I have a fever, and the only prescription is more spice. That was the worst. Anyway, continuing on here. Paul mounts the throne, right? Wages holy jihad all across the galaxy and all the planets that mankind has settled, right? And then ultimately, he has a child with Chaney. The child's name is Leto, right? And this is something that will probably happen. I don't know which Dune movie it's going to happen. It's not important, but this is what happens in the books, right? So Paul has a child with Chaney at first, right? And that child, Leto, never grows up because he's killed by the Sardaukar. So Paul is, obviously waging war against the Sardaukar with the Fremen. His child, Leto II, is killed, and ultimately, he is Leto II, because they name him after Paul's father, Leto, but then that kid dies, and then Paul has twins with Chaney, right? And Leto that name is used again for Leto II, who becomes, they're twins, Ganima and Leto, and Leto II becomes the God Emperor of Dune, right? In my opinion, not the most interesting character. I can't wait till hopefully, if you all like this content, I'll make a bunch of videos on God Emperor of Dune, because in my opinion, the lore behind him is really cool, but him as a character is one of the most boring, right, characters in the entirety of the Dune universe. There's so many, you could tell Frank Herbert's writing skill gets so much better just in between, the first three Dune books. So that's Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune, all the way to Chapter House, right? So that's, it's really interesting. So ultimately, Paul, he sees, right? So Paul has this prescient ability to see the future. At first, everybody's like, oh, that's awesome. He's the Kwisatz Haderach. He's the one to save us all, right? Obviously, the Bene Gesserit are afraid of him, and ultimately, after Paul and after the tyrant, Emperor Leto II, they decide they will never make another Kwisatz Haderach again. But it's kind of interesting, because in Paul's genes, in Leto II Atreides' genes, right, there's this ability to sort of shield yourself from other people with prescient abilities. And Ciana, who is an offspring of Leto II through Ganima and Emperor Carino's nephew, right? Yeah, it's so much to explain. But eventually, all of the Bene Gesserit are eventually all related to Paul. So it's it's interesting. This whole story expands thousands of years, right? So it takes place thousands of years in the future. But ultimately, the story that I'm more familiar with than this, A Song of Ice and Fire, the main series, right? The main series of books, A Song of Ice and Fire, only cover a few years. So imagine how much my mind fucking went crazy when I'm reading this story, working my way through all of the books, and then it just how big this story is, right? So let's get back to Paul. So eventually what happens with Paul is Paul decides that because of his pressing abilities, he doesn't want to lose his humanity. He sees what happens to Leto II, his son, right? And he ultimately decides that saving humanity is not worth him losing his humanity himself. So initially, Paul is tricked into, just to sort of summarize the events of Dune Messiah, Paul is tricked into going to go see one of his old, top advisors in his Fremen army, right? And when he does this, he's tricked by the Tleilaxu, which is this other organization of individuals that we're going to see brought in the next couple of Dune movies. But ultimately, Paul is tricked into going to go, and Paul knows it's going to happen. He allows it to happen because, like I said, Paul doesn't want to lose his humanity in order to save humanity, right? He felt like he does his part by waging jihad across, the holy war, these bloody banners and stuff. Like, he did this for years, and then ultimately he decides he doesn't want to take the next step down the golden path, which is to become, a god worm, live for thousands of years and direct humanity into what's known as the scattering, so that humanity can never be boxed in and will never be limited in its capacity like it is under the tyrant Emperor Leto II. So ultimately, that's what the full golden path is. The golden path is the path that leads humanity to ever expanding, ever changing, to always conquering new planets, new societies, so that they can never be boxed in and be brought to near distinction or extinction like they are in the Dune series. So that's ultimately what the golden path is, and that would require Paul himself to become a sandworm, right? And lose everybody that he's ever loved, everybody that he's ever been close with and all that stuff through just living for thousands of years and losing every single aspect of his humanity and becoming a sandworm. Paul decides he doesn't want to do that. So it's left up to his son, Leto II. Ultimately, the way that Paul is killed is kind of crazy, right? So it's one of the craziest deaths, in my opinion, in all of the books that I've read. And I've read a pretty decent number of, sci-fi fantasy books. But it happens in Children of Dune. Ultimately, right before this, Emperor Leto II, this is before he becomes full-on sandworm, right? Him and this dude, okay, so let me explain. At the end of Dune Messiah, after Paul is tricked into going to see one of his old companions that he waged jihad with, this guy was one of his top advisors, a stone burner attacks the building when Paul gets to the house. The stone burner then blinds Paul. And this is crazy because in Fremen society, when someone is blind, they just leave them out in the desert. They literally will just take them out to the desert and leave them and say, good riddance, your maker now belongs to Shai Hulud. You were just left for dead, right? So when this initially happens to Paul, he is blinded, but he can still see, right? So he can still make out shapes. He can still make out faces. He still has the pressing ability. Ultimately, this is what makes him live or continue to live on until at the end of the book, he can't see anymore. And then it just sort of ends with him going out into the desert. And then when Children of Dune picks up, all the other Dune books, we hear about these Coriolis storms and how they can shred the flesh off of bone or human. They can shred human flesh in a matter of seconds because these Coriolis storms are just so windy and so dangerous. It's like it's part of the sandworms infecting the weather control on Dune. These Coriolis storms are these massive things that nobody should be out in. And it's alluded to the fact that Paul got caught up in a Coriolis storm at the end of Dune Messiah and he's dead. Until in Children of Dune, you keep hearing about this character, the Prophet, and then finally the Prophet, like Jessica, who's Paul's mother, meets him, and it's confirmed. Also, through Gurnee Hallock, it's confirmed that this Prophet is Paul. Ultimately, like I was just saying before, Paul reveals himself to his son, Leto II. Leto confirms that this is Paul, the Prophet, right? And they go around to all of these different sietches, and they empty all of their water storages into the desert. Because at this time, in Children of Dune, Dune has been terraformed into a giant jungle planet. Sections of Dune have been terraformed into, habitable places where the idea that water is so sacred is starting to, sort of die off, right? It's really cool because eventually this story covers so much time and so much history that the Fremen that we know in the first 3 books become relics of history. And, in God Emperor of Dune, there's these people known as Museum Fremen, and they basically pretend to be Fremen because Paul, like, you gotta realize at the beginning of the story, the Fremen themselves are desert-dwelling nobodies, and nobody wants to fuck with them, and they suck, and, like, everybody underestimates them, and then part of the story is that Paul, uses that desert power to take out the entirety of the Carino dynasty that, Emperor Padishah is part of House Carino. So ultimately, it's crazy to see the Fremen be these lowly people, and then, they're so revered in thousands of years that people pretend to be them, and everything about Fremen society, like, you could have Chris knives or ancient steel suits and all that stuff. That's all, like, extremely valuable and faked and stuff. It's awesome. Frank Herbert is a genius. But ultimately, what happens is after Leto II and Paul Atreides go around to all the different CHs and leaking their water storages out into the desert, they make their way back to Arrakeen, right? And let me backtrack a bit. Aaliyah is Paul's sister. So in the Dune movie, Jessica is pregnant with Aaliyah. By the end of it, and she goes through what's known as the spice agony, and she drinks the water of life, and this makes the baby that's inside of her, Aaliyah, become aware of herself. So Aaliyah is just a few weeks old, and she becomes aware of every single person that's ever existed in her history. On the female side, she now has all of their memories when she's still inside the womb. And then she's born, and she can talk, and she can walk around, and she's way much older than her actual years. So eventually what happens to her, after Paul goes out into the desert, she takes his place. She's ruling, right? She's sort of doing like a conservatorship for Paul and Chaney's twins, Ganima and Leto II, right? Even though he's technically Leto III because Leto II died. It's crazy that that's never really addressed. Like Frank just moves on. But that's how all of society is at this time point. So, Aaliyah is becomes the main antagonist in the last book, and it's because she becomes possessed by, get this, Baron Harkonnen. So Paul Atreides, through his mother, is literally, like, Jessica is a daughter of Baron Harkonnen. So Paul has Harkonnen features. Paul's brows, his eyebrow right here is very Harkonnen-like. But because they descend from that line, they have Harkonnen genes, right? And Aaliyah has the prescient ability of connecting with all of, her female has before. She ends up getting possessed, right? She becomes an abomination, possessed by Baron Harkonnen, and she starts doing all these things that Baron Harkonnen did, and obviously they find out about it. Jessica knows about it, but ultimately she kills herself. Aaliyah jumps off of a balcony at this massive temple that's built for her, like after Paul supposedly went out to the desert, but Aaliyah knows that Paul is not dead. It's the prophet. She confirms this. Ultimately, he preaches against what she's doing. So that's something I'll need to do, like, many episodes to explain this story in depth. But ultimately, she kills herself, and this is when Paul is stabbed by a random person in the crowd. He's just assassinated. He's stabbed by someone in a yellow robe, one of the fish speakers, one of the loyalists, and he's killed and he's dead. All right. And then just to kind of keep this moving along here, the next character that I want to talk about is Chaney. Kind of been talking about her. Now this. Oh yeah. Let me go back real quick. This. Wait. Whoops. Did the wrong thing. This art was done, like the one over on the right is Adam Lane, right? That's a really awesome art of Paul. And then the one behind me is done by Sigu, an artist named Sigu. And then this is done by Maria Dimova. Let me move this just so I'm not in Chaney's face. Okay, so one of the big things about Chaney is that Chaney is a Fremen through and through. She's been part of Fremen society her whole life. Now, her father is Liet Kynes, right? In the movie, Liet Kynes was changed to a woman, but it's still there. It doesn't, like, she's, well, she doesn't really have the same death as she does in the books. That was the most disappointing thing. Liet Kynes, so Chaney's father, but mother in the movies, has this, he's this planetary ecologist who works for the Emperor himself, and he's supposed to be bipartisan in helping House Harkonnen relieve power and give it to House Atreides. But obviously he is not impartial, and he's loyal, at least they think he's loyal to the Emperor himself, but ultimately he's loyal to the Fremen. He's welcome in Sietch and City, right? So Liet Kynes, is a planetary ecologist that was sent there by the Emperor Padishah II, but he ends up accolading into their society and becomes a Fremen, and he's accepted in Siege, and they take his orders. The Fremen, you notice when he asked for coffee service, or when she asked for coffee service for Jessica and Paul, they listen to her, and that's when they kind of figure out, oh, this character, Liet Kynes, who's a male in the books, is actually accepted in Siege and also in cities. That's a big deal. So the Fremen themselves are supposed to be similar to, if I'm not mistaken, Muslims who fought in World War II, because one of the big inspirations for Dune itself was Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia is about, it's a true story about this British soldier who goes to work via the British Empire and helps out the Saudis fight. I don't know the exact story of Lawrence of Arabia. I've never read it, but supposedly it's heavily based. Dune is heavily based on that, right? So the Fremen themselves are this society of desert folks, and they ultimately ride sandworms. They are around and consume spice, which is this I'll talk about spice towards the end of this video. It's this geriatric drug that increases your mental acuity and increases your awareness. It gives you some prescient abilities. It also allows you to live longer, right? And then ultimately it gives you these deep blue within blue eyes. Doesn't matter if your eyes are brown like mine. If I consumed enough spice, they'd be blue within blue, because I'd be on the drug melange, right? Melange is just another is the technical name for the drug spice, right? So ultimately, the Fremen society that Chaney is a part of, Paul, like we see in the movie, has these dreams, and Chaney is the one that he sees, and then ultimately when he gets there and fights to the death with Jamis, Chaney and him fall in love. They have children. They have 3 children. Leto, we'll call him Leto the 1.5, and then obviously Leto 2, and then Ganima. Ganima doesn't, and this is interesting too, because I think Brian Herbert knows certain characters like Princess Irulan, Ganima, Chaney herself. These are characters that we love and want more about, because Frank didn't give us that much about them in his books. And remember, there's massive time jumps, like 1,500 years in between God Emperor of Dune and Heretics of Dune, and then 3,500 years in between Children of Dune and God Emperor of Dune. So it's crazy time jump. So that's one of the benefits about Brian Herbert's books. I haven't read any of them yet. I do know that Kevin J. Anderson is his co-author for those. I do know that people, like for instance, if you go to Brian Herbert, Frank Herbert's son's Twitter, and they just announced, recently that they're working on some new stuff, and you read all the comments, and it's just people saying like, oh, why do you keep, just trying to make money off of your father's work, or why are you doing that? I haven't honestly read the books, but I know that the writing is not going to be as good as Frank Herbert, but I do want to continue this story, because I'm on the last book that Frank wrote right now. So, I will eventually read it. But ultimately, Chaney, the way she dies is when she's giving birth to Ganima and Leto II, she was poisoned. She was being poisoned for years, for the entire length of the jihad. Is why they don't have any kids in between Leto 1.5 and the twins, Leto 2 and Ganima's, because she's being fed contraceptives by Princess Irulan. So when they find this out, they immediately take her off the contraceptives, and she becomes extremely fertile, extremely pregnant. And then her and Paul have a baby, twins. And the pregnancy makes Chaney consume massive amounts of spice, and she has to eat so much, and it's all because she was being poisoned by Princess Irulan for years. So ultimately, Irulan kills Chaney by feeding her these contraceptives that went undetected. They made the pregnancy high risk, and she dies giving birth to Ganima and Leto II. She gives birth to them, but ultimately dies after. And that's where Paul, the character Paul, dies. From that point forward, Paul, really the whole book, Paul never wants to become Wadib and this guy who's responsible for millions of deaths across the galaxy. But ultimately, when Chaney dies, he knows, I'm done. It's actually really sweet. So then that's when he, fully commits to that path. Like, Leto, because he's blind, there's this face dancer known as Sidetail who's about to kill Leto II and Ganima when they're infants, and they're just as prescient and as relevant as Aaliyah, who Aaliyah becomes crazy and she becomes possessed and an abomination by Baron Harkin and kills herself. But Sidetail, who's this person who works for this organization known as the Tleilaxu, he ends up, he's a face dancer. He ends up getting into the position where he's about to kill Paul and Chaney's children, and Chaney's there and Paul's there, and it's right before, but ultimately Paul puts his consciousness in Leto II's consciousness and sees through his eyes, because Paul's blind. He can't even see through prescience anymore at this point in the story. And Paul throws a knife, and that knife catches Sidetail in the throat and saves his son and his daughter's life. And then ultimately he goes out into the desert and dies, but then comes back in Dune Messiah and then really dies. So what's interesting about all of this is that Chaney is we get her POV, we get to know her thoughts, but ultimately she kind of, after she dies, there's so many more characters that we get so much more information on. So that's kind of what I was talking about the benefit of some of the other books with Brian Herbert. Okay, so then the next character that I want to talk about, and if you all like these videos, I'll edit them more where it's not just my face talking with the picture, but this art is of Jessica. This is Paul's mother, Muad'Dib's mother, right? And the art is by, I've been dreading trying to say this, but it's by Kate Kaznady, I think, maybe. Thank you for, making such a beautiful image. This is how my mind pictured Jessica when reading the books. To be honest, it's because Rebecca Ferguson, I think it's her name, the actress that plays her, is kind of loosely who I see, obviously, because I saw the movie before I ever read Dune. But ultimately, she's part of the Bene Gesserit. I've talked about them a bunch. One of the coolest things to know about her character is that she ultimately she betrays the Bene Gesserit by teaching their ways to her son Paul. And the reason why the Bene Gesserit are against teaching their ways to men is because when men learn their abilities and men contact all the other men who have lived in their genetic history and they become aware of them, they go batshit insane. Up until Paul, Muad'Dib. Paul is the only male who's been successfully taught the ways of the Bene Gesserit, connected to all of his male halves and his female halves in his genetic history, and this is why he's so special, right? Leto II does the same thing. He is Kwisatz Haderach is what they call them, right? So ultimately, the Bene Gesserit, and I need to talk more about their society. I really need to read some of the books that were done by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, because they cover, or I guess Brian makes up a lot of the lore that fills in the blanks that some of the stuff that Frank, sort of let out. But ultimately, right now, where I'm at with the Bene Gesserit, I never thought it would be possible that a character from the Bene Gesserit would be my favorite, but Odrade is amazing. Odrade, her name itself is, because this is 5,000 years after, this is 1,500 years after the 3,600 year reign of the tyrant Emperor Leto II. There's millions of Atreides people out there. So millions and millions, if not billions of people who have Atreides genome markers, and they have certain abilities. And people like Teg, who is a Bashar, and a Bashar is the term from the Sardaukar, which is like basically a general, the guy that was doing the the Mongolian throat singing in the first Dune. He's a Bashar. So Paul eventually consumes, or Emperor Leto II eventually consumes the Sardaukar into his Fremen fish speaker society. So they have, different titles like the Bashar. But there's one dude, Miles Teg, one of his genetic, and this is in Heretics of Dune and then in Chapter House of Dune. Miles Teg, spoilers, dies at the end of Heretics of Dune, and then he's brought back as a Gola, but as a clone. A Gola clone, not like the Duncan Idaho Golas that I'm going to talk about here in a second. So ultimately, he has this ability to speed up really fast. And it's crazy to read this because it was written in the 1980s. And obviously, we've seen characters like Quicksilver from X-Men. We've seen The Flash. We've seen them on live screen TV. So Frank is writing about a character who's doing that and it hasn't really been seen before. So the way he describes it is amazing. He's like, he moved through the building in a blink of an eye, leaving behind bathes of blood. Like, it's just awesome. Miles Teg is one of my favorite characters. So is Adrade. Adrade is like my favorite character next to A Song of Ice and Fire characters. You're bringing in Daenerys and Jon Snow and Tyrion and Gendry and Davos and Arya, right? So we're getting to that level, right? And I love those characters so much. Just go watch my Song of Ice and Fire videos if you want to know. But yeah, so Adrade is like, this Bene Gesserit mother who I think is like a flushed out version of Jessica. Is what Frank wanted to do with Jessica in the first books, but obviously there's the massive time jump, so he didn't actually have time, literally have time to do that. That's why Brian's probably gone back and sort of added some things to her character. But the next main that I want to talk about is Duncan Idaho. Now, the reason why I picked this image, this is by one of my favorite artists for not just Dune, but also A Song of Ice and Fire, and then also King Killer Chronicle. The man does the best artwork for all of my favorite things, right? So, Mark Simonetti did this, but this is a rendition of Duncan Idaho, and it's perfect because he has the steely eyes. So, obviously, Duncan Idaho, my boy, Paul, my boy, motherfucking Jason Momoa, right? He dies fighting the Saurodikar. He dies twice because remember he gets stabbed in the gut, then pulls a sword out and fights him again, right? But he dies there. He's ultimately dead, but his flesh is taken to an axolotl tank. The Tleilaxu make these things called a Gola, right? So what's gonna happen is in Dune Part 2. Jason Momoa is back. He's going to be brought back in the flesh as a Gola, which is kind of like a clone, but not really. Ultimately, it's the person who died is reborn, and their memories of their past lives at first are never, like, they're just a blank canvas. So Paul accepts this basically, I don't even know how to, it's Duncan Idaho, right? But he just doesn't have all the memories of his past life yet. And then eventually you find out that the Tleilaxu gave this Gola to Paul. When Paul is sitting on the throne, Paul is already emperor. He's like ruling the entirety of all of the planets, all of the galaxies, all of the systems that are in the old Imperium. Paul is ruling that, and he's given this Duncan Idaho Gola, and ultimately the Gola was a trick by the Tleilaxu, who is this other organization like the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, and the Mentats, and the Doctors, right? Ultimately, there's when Duncan's memories are restored, that's when he's supposed to kill Paul. Like, there's a certain trigger word that's said that will restore Duncan Idaho's memories or whatever, or a word that will be used that will trigger the thing that's laid deep down in the Gola's mind. And ultimately, through the first Duncan Idaho Gola, its memories are restored. And then that happens thousands of times throughout the story, to the point that now, the book that I'm reading now, that's 5,000 plus years after the events of Paul Atreides, Muad'Dib, his mother Jessica, Chaney, Leto II, all of that, Duncan is still the fucking main character. The original Duncan Gola has been brought back and survived through the millennia all these times, and he's alive now. He's a Mentat. Like, what would happen is with Emperor Leto II, he outlived everybody. One of the things that he loved was Duncan Idaho. He loved how Duncan Idaho would sometimes rebel against him, how loyal he was, how he made him think, how his personality, everything about him. So Duncan Idaho, what would happen is eventually the Golas would start to hate Emperor Leto II, and they would try to assassinate him. And Emperor Leto was prescient, so he could always see this happening, and he would just murder these Duncan Idaho Golas. But he would always have another one on the back burner coming through, and they would do different things, like have higher up positions in Emperor Leto II's society. He would breed with the fish speakers to bring in Duncan Idaho's genes into the Atreides line. Like, it was just Duncan Idaho is the main character of Dune. Like, I'm not even lying. The whole story revolves around Duncan Idaho in the end. Like, yes, it's about Paul. Yes, it's about Emperor Leto II. Yes, it's about the House Atreides genes. But the one thing that is consistent throughout this entire story is Duncan fucking Idaho. Like, I'm not like, it's crazy. I did not expect that when first reading this story. So I will do a podcast, an episode of my Dune podcast that will just feature all of the many different aspects of Duncan Idaho. But just sort of continuing on here, the next person I want to talk about is Gurnee Hallock. Now, Gurnee Hallock is played in I don't necessarily like his portrayal, Josh Brolin's portrayal of Gurnee Hallock in the Dune movies. And that's not Josh Brolin's fault. It's more so Denis Villeneuve's fault. Because this Gurnee Hallock is supposed to be a musician who is also a sword fighter. Gurnee Hallock in the Dune movie. Oh yeah, by the way, let me move this. This art is by Jack Dahl, by the way. Awesome rendition. Clearly, Josh Brolin was the inspiration behind this. The character, Gurnee Hallock, played by Josh Brolin. But in the movie, he's a sword fighter, and then the one scene of him playing the balisette is cut. It was cut. Like, there was a scene that was supposedly of him cut. But you got to realize he has that scar on his face is from like an ink. That's not really that important. What is important is like that I just didn't. This is why I wanted to talk about Gurnee Hallock. He eventually starts hooking up with Jessica, and then lives out the rest of his days with her on Caladan. He plays a role towards the end of Children of Dune when he comes back with Jessica. Ultimately, he's supposed to be this dude who's this musician who is also one of the best fighters in all of not just House Atreides, but also the Imperium. So we got half of who he is on screen. I need more of the musician. I want to see him actually playing the balisette, because a lot of the ways that he talks relate to lyrics from his music. He's a very poetic motherfucker. Like, he's constantly quoting deep things, and I didn't really get that in the version that we got in Dune 2020. So I was disappointed. So that was why I brought that up. I just wanted to mention that. Then the next character, or the next, not character per se, but the next thing that I want to talk about is shields. Shields, and more specifically, what are they, right? So, like, I remember I made a video right before the Dune movie was supposed to be released, and then, remember, it got delayed. Shields themselves are a force field. In short, literally just a force field that will block bullets. The whole idea behind it is that it blocks fast-moving projectiles that would blast a hole in you. In short, that's what it is. It's a force field, right? So everybody uses them in the Imperium. Not the Fremen don't use them, but that's specifically because shields, they drive the worms insane. So like when a worm is very sensitive to sound, and there's a frequency that a shield emits, and it drives the worms even more into a frenzy than they already are. So the only society that really doesn't use shields in this Dune universe are the Fremen. And eventually, like, the shields kind of become a back plot. But ultimately, in the first book, they're a thing. So one way to get through a shield, or one of the ways to, like, still kill people, even though everybody's wearing these shields, is to train with a sword. Because a sword and a knife will move slow enough, potentially, to penetrate a force field, because it's this massive, big object, and it kind of, if placed at the right angle and the right speed, can be forced through, like we saw in the fighting scene with Gurnee Hallock and Paul in the movie, right? So that's why they use these old school weapons like swords and knives and just different things. Like, they still have las guns, they still have dart projectile weapons, but ultimately one of the best ways to kill someone quickly is if you're in hand-to-hand combat, is with a sword, with a knife. So in short, shields are force fields, and they are meant to block bullets. Ultimately, guns are the best way to kill people, and shields are a direct result of that. Like, they were made to block fast-moving projectiles that would blow a hole in, the person who the gun was aimed at. So that's what shields are, in short. And then the next thing I want to talk about is the actual technology. And I've been talking about this a lot throughout this whole podcast. But the reason why the technology seems so crude and not necessarily futuristic is because all aspects of AI are removed. So these ornithopters are designed after dragonflies, right? Because dragonflies can I think that's what I feel like the design from the movie looks like the most. Like an ornithopter was designed by there was who is that ancient philosopher dude that everybody loves to quote, Nostradamus, right? So if I'm not mistaken, or no, not Nostradamus. It doesn't matter. The ornithopter is the way it is because there's no AI to it. So there's no advanced like displays, right? So there wouldn't be a massive computerized display that would show the best way to land. It's kind of hard to explain. Aside from what they show us visually on, so I'm trying to kind of include what Dune the movie is doing with the design of the ornithopters, and that kind of threw me off. But ultimately, all of the technology, not just the ornithopter themselves, everything is man-powered. So there's no artificial intelligence that allows a machine to maneuver itself. So you have the Spacing Guild, which I believe that was the next topic that I want to talk about. Yes, the Spacing Guild. Now, these images, this one right here, those aren't the actual Spacing Guild members from the Dune movie. Those are representatives of the Spacing Guild. Somebody like an actual Spacing Guild member, Elric, is pictured right here in the 1984 Dune, and that's perfect. That's the one thing this movie got absolutely perfect. In a sense, like obviously their design could change, but they're these massive deformed humans, and the reason why they're deformed is because they've been using so much spice to navigate through space. Like they fold space and then they get you there within a matter of minutes. So like the technology itself is something that's probably discussed in those Brian Herbert and Kevin Anderson books, right? But I haven't read those. So what is explained up until Chapter House Dune, which is 6 books into the story, is that the Spacing Guild uses spice to allow them to navigate these massive space freighters that open up holes in the space-time continuum and fold the space in front of them, like literally just open up a wormhole, travel through it, and then fold it back closing, like you get to your destination that would have taken centuries or thousands or millions of years to travel to. You get there within minutes, right? So it is interesting, or one of the things that I've noticed about some of the information that we're giving about the space traveling is that it's very disorienting. It's jarring because your cells are spun through something and you're repositioned in a way that you're not normal. It's not natural, right? So it'll be interesting to see the way that they take this technology, like for the Spacing Guild in the new Dune movie. Like I said, the members of the Spacing Guild, all of them for the most part are deformed. Like the Elric character who plots against Paul, is working with the Reverend Mother Gaius Helena Mohaim and Baron Harkin and stuff like. There's kind of a description of what they look like, but I know Dennis is going to go, above and beyond, because right now one of the most accurate depictions I think is from the 1984 Dune movie. So then one of the last things I want to talk about for this episode is spice. What is spice itself? So spice is a drug that is initially, I think we end up finding out that the first emperor, Shaddam, or one of the emperors in House Carino, initially put the sandworms on Arrakis. In Dune, Arrakis didn't always look like how it did, this giant desert planet. It's a result of having these worms put on them. So basically, spice is exuded. Let me go back real quick because this is kind of leading into this. So the reason why the Spacing Guilds are in that tank is because they need to be in a chamber that's filled with melange gas, right? So this orange gas is constantly coating them in melange, and they excrete the gas when they're in these tanks, right? So ultimately, the spice itself and the fact that they're constantly inhaling these gases and they've been doing it for so long, this is why they're deformed and why they look like they do. So melange not only allows the Spacing Guild to use their spaceships to fold, time and space to get to a location faster, but also it extends your age. Your natural age expectancy is increased. For instance, one of the characters, Moneo, who is very close with Emperor Leto II, is something like 180 years old or something like that. And also in the main timeline with Paul Atreides, spice is addictive. It is a drug, but it's a geriatric drug. It increases your quality of life. It increases the amount of time you can live. It is addictive, but ultimately, if you can continue consuming it in the right way, you can extend the amount of time that you're alive. Ultimately, it gives the user prescient abilities, whereas with Paul, his Atreides genome that he gets, the genome markers or the genetic sequences that he gets from House Harkonnen and his Atreides ancestry gives him this super, like he has basically a trait in his genes that makes him super, like, not necessarily allergic to the spice, but super susceptible to it. So when he consumes it, it enhances his abilities so much more. So this is how he can literally begin to see the future, right? So the Bene Gesserit use this daily. They know they're addicted. Like, Odrade knows she's addicted to it. And the person she's training to come up, like her helper, hasn't... It's just an interesting conversation Odrade has with her helper about how addictive spice is and how she knows it and how it's not like they know that if they didn't have it, they would be basically nothing, right? So it's interesting. If I had to compare it to a drug in real life, obviously caffeine, that's an easy choice because caffeine increases your mental acuity, but it doesn't necessarily make you live longer. Also, maybe a little bit like mushrooms. Mushrooms sometimes allows you to feel like you have prescient abilities. And then also probably some heroin because it seems like the way that Frank describes certain characters using it in certain settings, it seems like it relaxes them in a sense. So I don't know. It's a drug. It's a space drug. And then that's it. That's the last thing. I want to thank you all so much for watching. If you could please do me a massive favor, right? And slap a like on this video. Or this podcast rather. It's probably pretty long. I'm sorry for that. Hopefully you enjoyed it though, right? So thank you for watching. Alone not. That's the thing that I say for my Song of Ice and Fire content. If you want more Dune stuff, let me know down below and let me know by watching this. One of the best things you can do if you're a fan of anybody here on YouTube is to put their videos in a playlist, or like me, I already have playlists, and just let it cycle. Just turn it on and just walk away. Just let it continuously keep playing. So it just lets YouTube know, hey, this person, has fans and promote their videos in the algorithm. It's kind of what it does. But if you can't do any of that, thank you for watching. Alone not. Bless the maker in his water.